I started this meeting about 2 minutes after the normal start time, 5:30. I think I just missed Kurt, so I apologize for that. I was racing over to get started and started 2 minutes late, so I'm sorry about that. But I'm just going to quickly, since there's nobody in Zoom, I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about chapter 2 and the labs that you're going to need to do, the assignments. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's go ahead and share screen 2. Okay, so there we go. Oops, I'm signed into the wrong class. I'm signed into Security Plus. Let's go into CNT 120. Okay, so everybody should have figured out how to get onto the virtual lab by now. If you haven't and you haven't emailed me, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get in touch with me if you haven't figured that out. But let's go ahead and I need to see if I can get this thing out of the way. Guess not. There we go. Okay. Okay, so chapter 2 is titled Installing Windows Server 2016. Now, if you've taken any CNT classes up to this point, particularly CNT 110, I don't know about CNT 100 off the top of my head, but the prerequisites for this course are usually CNT 100, 115, or 110. Hopefully you guys have taken CNT 110. If not, I'll see you in there at some point. But in any event, CNT 110 sort of has you at one point install Windows Client Edition. You know, in the case of more recent students, that would have been Windows 10 or Windows 7. Those would be the client versions of Windows. Installing Windows Server editions is essentially the same thing. Now, there are some slight variances in the install process, but it's pretty similar in terms of the overall, you know, pop the disk in, you know, boot to your optical drive, or if you're installing from a flash drive, boot to your flash drive. However you're doing that process, you would sort of follow the same steps in that way. Because we're in a online environment where not everybody has access to VMware, and I'm not insisting on everybody getting access to VMware, we're doing things through a virtualization client. I've omitted the labs where you install Windows Server. Now, I would recommend, if you've never installed a Windows operating system before, to go ahead and, you know, get in touch with me and make the effort, and I can help you with that. There are labs for that. I'm more than happy if somebody was like, I've never done this before, I'd really like to give it a shot. Please do, yeah, get in touch with me, you know, shoot me an email. I don't care if you don't want to, that's fine. If you already know how to install an operating system, you've done that before, that's great. It's pretty cut and dry, but if you've never done it, it's worth it to at least do it one time, and I can help you out with that. So I can help you facilitate that. As far as your grade is concerned, however, there's only 2 labs for this chapter. They are 2-3 and 2-5, and that deals a little bit more with post-installation deployment. Okay, so you're going to install server roles, which roles in Windows Server, well, first of all, you view roles. It's 2-3. And in 2-5, you install, I believe it's this 2-5 initial configuration tasks. I guess maybe it's in the next chapter. But at some point, you will install roles for yourself. And that's part of the post-deployment process of Windows Server. And much of that work is done in Server Manager. So we're going to go ahead and power on this server. I did mention in an email recently that after 5 hours of inactivity on your server, it will be shut down automatically. So make sure that if you're working on a lab, you complete the lab within 5 hours, or else you'll be kicked out automatically by the system. And that's just to save resources so that when other people log in, it's not bogged down. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sign in here. And we're going to take a look at doing these labs really quickly. I'm going to kind of just do them, and you guys can follow along, or, you know, if you'd like to get out your textbook and do it yourself, you don't need to watch this video. You can end the video here. You can do it yourself. This is just going to be sort of, I'm going to kind of be explaining some additional stuff as I go, throwing things out there that'll help you out. But this is just sort of so you can visualize what you should be doing yourselves. So the first thing you do in 2-1 is you're going to open Server Manager. When you boot up Windows Server, any version newer than 2008 Server Manager is going to open automatically. Oops, let's go ahead and close out of here. We're not really worried about getting the latest updates. Oh, that's one more thing is the servers will do automatic updates at night, so that you don't get those messages all the time. They do them every Friday, or they're supposed to. So just be aware of that. Friday at like 2 a.m. So it shouldn't affect your labs. But if you're doing labs on Friday at 2 a.m., then you might get kicked out for updates. So we start Server Manager, and then we're going to go to the local server, and then we're going to take a look at roles and features down here. Here we go. So roles and features. Now, roles are going to be in the category of things that your server is responsible for taking care of. Things that list is pretty long. You can read about it in the textbook, and it will give you detailed descriptions of different roles. There's quite a few roles that a server can provide, a Windows server can provide. But essentially, when you talk about the type of server that you're running, really that's talking about what roles are installed. So when you're dealing with even like a file sharing server that's Linux based, it's not necessarily Windows based. That would be a server that is providing a particular role, okay? And so that would be file and storage services. They might not have that same exact name when you're dealing with Linux. In fact, they don't. But that's sort of the idea of a role when you're dealing with Windows Server, is it's what task does this server perform? And in this case, built-in, Windows Server has file and storage services built in, because that's kind of what they expect as a minimum that your server is going to be doing. And so part of that includes storage services. That would be a role service. That would be something within the services realm. You can actually see it in a couple of different ways, but I'm just going to show you here in the services Microsoft Management Console Snap-in. We'll see under S, storage services, okay? And so this is going to be a service that gets installed or gets enabled as you install, I guess installed and enabled as you install file and storage services. So there'll be other services that will install, like for instance, DHCP server service, right? DHCP client service comes built in, but DHCP server service, if you're offering that role, right? Say you want your server to be handing out IP addresses to the network, you would install DHCP, the role DHCP. So we've got that open. It asks us what roles are installed. Okay, so this one does have us install, what is it? File, no, it has this in, okay, it just wants us to look at it. So we go add roles and features under manage. And this is the basics of what you're going to do. You know, out of the box, you install Windows Server, you go through that whole process, which, you know, hopefully, everybody's done a basic Windows installation, at least of a client operating system. If not, again, I can help you with that. But you're going to go through role-based or feature-based installation in order to add a new role. Again, this is stuff that you will do in Windows Server regardless. If you're even the most basic administrator of a Windows Server, you're going to be adding roles. Now, there's a lot of different things, and you can go through the textbook and read about the different ones. Some of the more common roles that you see installed out of the box: Active Directory. Now, Active Directory requires a certain amount of additional licensing. You don't just buy a Windows Server license and install Active Directory and bada bing, bada boom, you've got a domain. If you're doing it right, or if you're doing it the way you're supposed to, according to Microsoft licensing, then you need to install licenses for all of the users and or all of the computers that you're going to be adding as part of your domain. But that's a very common role that you see installed. DHCP server is also very common. If you're installing Active Directory, you also will install DNS, and we will do both of those in labs. Now, there is, and I'm going to try and get to this before we get to, I believe it's chapter 5. I have to look ahead and figure out which chapter this is. But when you install Active Directory, it automatically installs DNS server as well. It installs that role automatically because Active Directory requires DNS in order for it to function properly. DNS, for those who don't know, who haven't, well, I guess everybody should know at least that it's domain name system, and it's what in essence translates a domain name to an IP address or reverse, right? IP address to domain name. And so Active Directory requires DNS in order to function properly. We'll extrapolate out on that in further chapters, but that's just a basic understanding. So you often will see Active Directory and DNS installed. DHCP, very common as well. In at least, in even small networks, you'll see those. Print and document services, I believe it has you install this. I know at some point you will install this. It might be in the next chapter. I'm fairly certain that you will install print and document services in the next chapter. Remote access, formerly known as routing and remote access. If you'd like your server to act in the role of a router, you can do that. You can actually install services that allow for that capability. You don't commonly see that. Biggest mistake of a lot of newbies, and I've made this mistake myself, is you go, oh yeah, you've got a server. Let's just go ahead and put it right on the border of your network. We'll plug in, we'll just pop in 2 network interface cards. We'll plug one end in out to your internet connection, your modem or whatever, and then we'll plug the other end into your switch. We'll set it all up with routing and remote access, and then that'll be your VPN server. It'll be your whatever else, The big problem with doing that is, well, number one, security is a major issue. You can use Windows Firewall to sort of help mitigate some of the security risks of that. But if you have, for instance, if you have your file and print sharing, or file and storage services, rather, on the same server as your routing, that's handling your routing, it's possible that you could be more susceptible to attacks from the outside. So not really smart if you have data that needs to be secured. If you're just running it for remote access purposes, you can do that. The other major issue is that Windows Server is a significant drain on just running Windows Server itself. The operating system itself is a significant drain on processing resources. So your CPU and your RAM. So if you have a cheesy server, not a high-end, high-dollar server, it ends up being sort of inefficient for routing. Okay, so it's not the most efficient operating system for routing, right? Cisco iOS is far better. And so is, even there's a million Linux distros that do routing, pfSense and RouterOS and just tons of different, much better options for routing. So not really recommended. I have done it and I've gone, okay, this was a big mistake. I'm going to turn that off and change that. There are some situations where you would use remote access as a routing. I think that's why they've done away with it, because they're not very efficient at it. So they just call it remote access. You can still use your server as a router, but it's not very common anymore. But what you see that oftentimes used for is things like VPN services and remote desktop services that make it, well, remote desktop services and routing, remote access kind of go hand in hand. So these two roles would often be installed together. If you want a web server, an HTTP server, that would be IIS is the name of the service. They've kind of they haven't really gone away from the name. They just, to simplify it for user's sake, they call it web server, and then they throw IIS in brackets there. You can also install, if you have at least standard or above, you can install this Windows Server Essentials experience. I hate Essentials. It's a huge pain in the butt. When you learn Windows Server in a more nuanced way, Server Essentials becomes a huge nightmare. So it's something that we don't really learn in these classes, but it's sort of meant to make it simple. So you can set up an entire domain, with Active Directory domain services and file sharing and everything else in a simplified fashion. That's what Windows Server Essentials does. If you're paying for Windows Server Standard, using Windows Server Essentials Experience is kind of a waste of your money. If you want Essentials Experience, go buy Essentials. That's my recommendation anyway. Deployment services are often used. That's for installing Windows on a number of different computers. That can be pretty handy if you're in a large network. Print and document services, something that you see a lot. Network policy and access services, something you see quite often. Hyper-V is Windows virtualization environment. We've moved away from that at Yavapai College. We used to use that for our labs, but it's pretty bad for that. If you're doing domain virtualization, where you're using thin clients that access your server, which would be your thick client, using Hyper-V is not the worst thing in the world. But again, I prefer like VMware vSphere, which is a third-party tool. And then Windows Server Update Services is also something you see a lot. That just sort of simplifies updates. With Windows 10, it can be pretty beneficial because a lot of times Windows 10 updates break things. And so if you install Windows Server Update Services on your domain controller, you can disable automatic updates in Windows 10, which is something you can't do outside of a domain. Windows 10 has pretty much removed that capability. So having Windows Server Update Services on your server, you can sort of pick and choose and be a little bit more discretionary about what updates go through to your domain members. So that can be pretty handy. So what else does this have you do? I guess that's basically it. You're going to take a screenshot at some point in there. I'm not sure exactly which step. I believe it's right here that you take your screenshot. But in any event, you can figure that out when you do the lab. So basically, this chapter goes through a lot of the services. It delves into that. Let me look at the front here. Just take a look at a couple of other little bits of info. I'm trying to keep these videos sort of short, so I think I'm going to end it pretty quickly here. I just want to make sure I'm covering everything that needs to be covered. There's a little bit of Windows Server Core. Windows Server Core is essentially the command line only version of Windows Server. That's something that sort of a more advanced idea. This class doesn't delve into it that much. You looked at PowerShell a little bit in the last chapter. That's essentially what Windows Server Core is just PowerShell. If you're installing Windows Server, you need to be careful. With Server 2012 and Server 2016, the default version is the Server Core version, meaning it installs without a GUI. It's just command line. And so you need to be careful that you don't accidentally install your server because you have to redo it. So just be aware of that. What else do we have going on here? This chapter delves into activating Windows Server. Let's look at 2-5 really quickly. And we will, okay, so this has you open Server Manager again. Okay, and so this is something that you often will deal with when you're dealing with a brand new server. There's several initial configuration tasks, one of which you've already done in the last chapter. That's setting an IP address. You almost never set up a Windows server that does not have a static IP address. I guess there may be some certain situations and circumstances where you want to have DHCP, but if you're doing a domain controller, that's not even an option. Domain controller, DNS, DHCP server, you have to have a static IP address for any one of those things. And then having a static IP address is a good idea anyway. If you ever switch out your DHCP server, or if your server is your DHCP server, then it's kind of a necessary thing. So often that's one of the first things you'll do as those initial configuration tasks. And you can do that in a couple of different ways, but typically what you'll do is, I don't know exactly what the lab has you do, but that's not really the biggest deal in the world. Oh, this should be changed. Well, let me do mine real quick. Set it to the correct IP address. 192.168.120.25. 192.168.120.250. And then that will be our DNS. As well. Okay, and you'll notice if you did your IP address incorrectly, you should be online when you're done. So if you're not online for some reason, that means you've incorrectly configured your IP address settings, and you can get in touch with me on that. It looked like everybody that did it, did the lab, did them correctly. There were a few labs missing, by the way, and so those will be docked points. I encourage you guys, you know who you are, to still get those done, because you do not want to take a 0. If they're not done by next Monday, the grade will drop down to a 0. So, and so, okay, so the initial configuration tasks. You'll go to your local server here. This is where you can configure your computer name. That's one of the things that has you do. So we're going to go ahead and throw in my XX. We're going to put in 25 for me. And you would configure a domain here, but at this point we haven't configured a domain controller. We're not adding this to an existing domain. This will be, later on, it will be a domain controller. So basically you're just changing the computer name there. I believe it has you take a screenshot at that point. Has you set your IP address, which you've already done in the last chapter, I believe. And so that's essentially it. Does it have you? Okay, it has you look at Windows Firewall, which I guess we will. Okay, after you change your computer name, you have to restart, but I'm going to do that later. As you, oh, whoops, I shouldn't close Server Manager yet. There we go. As you look at Windows updates right here, so there are updates available. They're not set to install automatically, but I could install them right then. But I'm going to skip that. So Windows Firewall has you change this to on and on. And then it closes you out, and then you take a look at your TCP/IP settings like you did in Chapter 1 where you changed them. So pretty cut and dry. If you have trouble, feel free to contact me. We're right about at a half hour, so I'm going to cut the meeting off there. Hopefully I've given you some new little bits of information to help you out. We will be installing some roles later, so I'll delve into that in a little bit more detail, show you some of the cool things that the book won't necessarily talk much about unless you're really reading through the material. But other than that, I guess we are done now, and I am going to end this meeting. I'll see you next week.